Captain Jake Draven stood on the observation deck of his ship, staring out at the endless black of space. The stars glittered like diamonds, but his mind wasn't on the beauty of the galaxy. It was on the mysterious message he had just received, an invitation from the Zoth Empire, one of the oldest and most powerful civilizations in the universe. He had heard of the Zoth before. They were known for their advanced technology and ruthless efficiency in battle. But what was more intriguing was their queen, Seraphis. She was an enigma, a ruler who rarely interacted with other species and only summoned the best of the best when she needed something. And now she had summoned Jake. The message had been simple. You are requested for special training. Come to the Zoth capital world. Jake had no idea what special training meant, but he didn't question it. He was one of the best soldiers Earth had to offer, a veteran of countless battles. If someone as powerful as the Queen of Zoth wanted him, there had to be a reason. His ship, a sleek black stealth craft, slipped silently through the stars as it approached Zoth. The planet was massive, its surface covered by sprawling cities that stretched for miles. As the ship descended through the atmosphere, Jake felt a strange mix of excitement and tension. He had faced many challenges in his career, but this felt different. Upon landing, Jake was escorted by a group of Zothian guards, tall, armored beings with sharp features and an air of silent authority. They didn't speak to him, just gestured for him to follow. The walk through the Zoth capital was a blur of towering spires, massive stone structures, and alien technologies that Jake had never seen before. It felt like stepping into another world, one far beyond anything humanity had created. They led him to a palace, the size of a small city. The architecture was alien, yet beautiful, with sharp angles and flowing lines that seemed to defy the rules of physics. The air was thick with a strange energy, a kind of hum that seemed to vibrate through his bones. Jake's mind raced as they entered the palace. What was this training about? And why had he been chosen? He had been briefed on the Zoth before, but this felt like something more, something important. At the center of the palace was a large, circular chamber. It was dimly lit, the only light coming from strange, glowing crystals embedded in the walls. Standing at the far end of the room, surrounded by an eerie stillness, was Queen Seraphis. She was taller than any human, with smooth silver skin that shimmered in the low light. Her eyes, dark and endless, seemed to look through him as if she could see everything about him, every secret, every fear. She was both beautiful and terrifying, a perfect example of the power and mystery that the Zoth Empire represented. Jake stood at attention, his back straight, his fists clenched by his sides. He had dealt with powerful leaders before, but this was different. There was something about Seraphis that made him uneasy, something in the way she held herself, in the way the air around her seemed to shimmer with power. "You are Draven, captain of Earth's Special Forces," Seraphis' voice echoed in Jake's mind, a soft, soothing tone that somehow still carried an undeniable command. She didn't speak out loud. She was communicating telepathically. Jake nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He was trained to face danger, but this was beyond anything he had ever prepared for. "I have brought you here for a reason," Seraphis continued, her words wrapping around Jake's mind. "Your species has something special, something untapped, and I intend to see what it is." Jake frowned. "What do you mean?" Seraphis smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was cold, calculating. "I will show you. But first, you must prove yourself." Before Jake could respond, she raised her hand, and the room seemed to twist. The walls shimmered, and the air grew thick with tension. A feeling of unease settled in Jake's stomach. Something told him that this wasn't going to be easy. "You are not just here to guard me," Seraphis said. "You are here to become something more, something beyond human. Do you accept this challenge?" Jake took a deep breath. He didn't know what he was getting into, but one thing was clear. The Queen of Zoth had a plan, and he was part of it. He had no choice but to follow through. "I accept," Jake said, his voice steady despite the uncertainty swirling inside him. Seraphis' smile widened. "Good. Let the training begin." And with those words, the chamber around him shifted. And Jake knew nothing would ever be the same again. Jake Draven's mind raced as he followed Queen Seraphis deeper into the palace. The air felt thicker now, charged with energy. The walls seemed to pulse, and the strange humming sensation that had filled the halls earlier now felt like it was vibrating through his very bones. Seraphis led him through a long, narrow corridor, and Jake's boots echoed loudly on the stone floor. She didn't speak, her presence overwhelming and silent, as if she were testing him without saying a word. The tension in the air was so thick that it seemed to close in around him. Eventually, they reached a massive door, one so large and imposing that it almost seemed like it didn't belong in the palace at all. It was made of dark metal, covered with intricate symbols that Jake couldn't even begin to understand. Without a word, Seraphis raised her hand, and the door slowly creaked open, revealing a vast chamber beyond. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocating. The air was hot and thick, and the space was filled with strange creatures, massive beasts, each more terrifying than the last. Their glowing eyes followed Jake as he entered the room, and their growls echoed around him, making his skin crawl. The floor was uneven, covered with jagged rocks and strange plants that seemed to move on their own. Jake felt his heart race as he stepped forward, but Seraphis stood behind him, her voice cutting through the growing tension. "This is your first trial," she said, her tone cold and calculating. "You will face these creatures, but they are not the true challenge. The real test lies within you. Can you face the fear that lies in your heart?" Jake's mind flashed to the battles he had fought in his life, the chaos, the blood, the constant fight for survival. He had faced monsters before, but none of them had made him feel like this. His breath quickened as his pulse thudded in his ears. The creatures began to move, their massive claws scraping against the floor, but he stood firm. "I've faced worse than this," Jake muttered under his breath, trying to convince himself. But Seraphis was right. This wasn't just about the creatures. It was about something deeper, something he hadn't yet understood. The first beast lunged at him, its jaws snapping open in an attempt to crush him. Jake dodged to the side, his training kicking in as he drew his energy blade, the hum of its power filling the air. He struck quickly, cutting into the creature's side, but the beast didn't slow down. Instead, it let out an ear-piercing screech and spun around to attack again. Jake parried, the force of the blow pushing him back. His mind was clouded with panic, the roar of the beast ringing in his ears. He had trained for moments like this: combat, survival, quick thinking. But there was something else pressing on his mind now, something deeper: fear. He had always fought to survive, to protect those he loved, but this was different. The creatures weren't the real danger. It was his own fear, his own doubts that threatened to overwhelm him. The beast lunged again, and Jake barely had time to react. He slashed with his blade, but this time, he didn't just focus on the creature. He focused on the fear inside him. The doubt that had been there all along, buried beneath the surface, waiting for a chance to rise. He felt a pulse of energy, raw, unrefined, but powerful. His hand shook as he reached out, drawing the energy into his blade. The hum grew louder, brighter, until it was like a force of nature. With a cry, he unleashed the full force of the energy, slicing through the beast with a surge of power that felt almost like an explosion. The creature collapsed to the ground, its massive body crumpling in defeat. But Jake didn't stop there. He turned toward the other beasts, his pulse racing, the fear still clawing at him. But now, he knew what he had to do. He had to push forward. One by one, the creatures fell, each strike stronger than the last. The energy coursing through him felt different now, controlled, focused. It wasn't just about strength. It was about will. His will. He wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting to conquer the fear inside him, to prove that nothing, no matter how powerful, could break him. When the last creature fell, Jake stood over it, panting, his body covered in sweat. The chamber fell silent. The strange humming in the air faded, and he felt the weight of the room lift. Seraphiz's voice came from behind him, her tone colder than ever. "You have passed the first test, but there are more to come." Jake turned to face her, his heart still pounding. "What now?" Seraphiz's eyes narrowed, a hint of approval in her gaze. "You have shown strength, but the true test is not over. You must learn to control what you've unlocked. Only then will you understand what you are truly capable of." Jake nodded, still catching his breath. He had passed the first trial, but he knew that much more awaited him. There was no going back now. He had stepped into the unknown. And now, there was no turning back. Jake stood in the center of the strange chamber, his body still shaking from the battle with the creatures. His mind buzzed with the energy that had flowed through him, a feeling he couldn't quite explain. The Zoth beasts were gone, their massive forms lying motionless on the ground, but the victory felt hollow. It wasn't the creatures he had defeated that mattered. It was what had happened to him, what Seraphiz had unlocked inside him. He breathed deeply, trying to steady himself. The power inside him was still there, swirling like a storm waiting to be unleashed. But it wasn't just the power that worried him. It was how easily it had come to him, how quickly he had tapped into it. Was this really him? Or had the Zoth Queen turned him into something else? Seraphiz's voice broke through his thoughts. "You have done well, Captain, but the first trial is only the beginning." He turned to face her, his mind still racing. She stood there, watching him with an expression that was hard to read, neither pleased nor disappointed. Her eyes, though, held something else, something calculating. "You are not just fighting creatures, Jake," Seraphiz continued. "You are fighting your own limits. You have tapped into an energy that humans have never fully understood. But this power is not without its dangers. The question now is, can you control it?" Jake clenched his fists, feeling the power pulse beneath his skin. "I controlled it before. I can do it again." Seraphiz raised an eyebrow, an almost imperceptible smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "We will see." With a wave of her hand, the chamber shifted again, the walls shimmering as if the space itself was alive. The floor beneath Jake's feet seemed to dissolve, and suddenly, he was standing in a vast, empty void. The blackness around him stretched on forever, and the only light came from the strange energy swirling inside him. A deep, resonant voice echoed through the void. It wasn't Seraphiz's voice, but something older, more ancient. "You are now facing the true test." Jake's heart pounded in his chest. He had no idea what this was, but he wasn't about to back down. He reached for the energy inside him, trying to summon the same power he had used earlier. But this time, the energy felt different, wild, chaotic, like it was slipping out of his control. A figure appeared before him, emerging from the shadows. It was human-shaped, but its features were twisted, distorted. Its eyes glowed with the same energy that pulsed within Jake. The figure raised its hand, and suddenly, Jake felt a surge of energy blast through him, pushing him to the ground. His body hit the hard surface with a force that left him gasping for air. "You are weak," the figure said, its voice distorted and mocking. "You have power, yes, but you have no control." Jake gritted his teeth and forced himself to his feet. He couldn't let this thing get to him. He had to focus. He reached again for the energy, this time trying to slow his breathing, to center himself. The figure attacked again, its energy striking at him like a wave. Jake stumbled but managed to hold his ground. The power was there, but he had to harness it, not let it consume him. "Focus," he muttered to himself. "Control. Control." He closed his eyes, reaching deep within himself, searching for the calm he needed. Slowly, the storm of energy began to settle. It was still there, but now it was under his command. He opened his eyes, feeling the power surge through him, and with a shout, he launched himself at the figure. This time, when he struck, it wasn't with wild force, it was precise. His energy flowed like a controlled current, cutting through the void like a blade. The figure staggered back, its form flickering as if it was fading. Jake pressed forward, his control over the energy growing stronger with every moment. "You are learning," the figure said, its voice no longer mocking, but almost impressed. With one final blast of energy, Jake forced the figure to the ground, the power surging out of him in a blinding explosion. The figure disappeared in a flash of light, leaving Jake standing alone in the void. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, the voice returned. "You have passed this trial, Captain. But remember, this power is a gift and a curse." The void dissolved around him, and Jake found himself back in the chamber with Seraphis. He was panting, sweat dripping from his brow, but something inside him had changed. He had done it. He had controlled the power. Seraphis watched him, her expression unreadable. "You did well. But this is only the beginning. There is much more for you to learn. You must continue to control the power within you, or it will control you." Jake nodded, still catching his breath. He had learned something important today. The power was real, and it was his to command, but only if he could learn to control it. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he knew one thing for sure. The Zoth Empire had unlocked something inside him, something that could change everything. He had to be ready for whatever came next. Jake Draven stood in the center of the training chamber, his body still tingling with the aftereffects of the trial. The power inside him had responded to his will, but it left him with a new kind of unease. The energy was there, but how long would it take before it began to consume him? Seraphis's warning echoed in his mind. This power is a gift and a curse. The thought gnawed at him, but he shook it off. He had made it through the trial. That meant something, right? He had controlled the power. For now, that was enough. But as he turned to face the Zoth Queen, something about her calm demeanor made him uneasy. Her eyes watched him with an unreadable expression, and for the first time, Jake felt like he was the one being judged. "You've learned much in a short time," Seraphis said, her voice smooth like silk, "but you are still not ready for what lies ahead." Jake clenched his fists, the energy humming beneath his skin. "I'm ready," he said, more to convince himself than her. "I can control it." Seraphis raised an eyebrow. "Can you? Or are you just fooling yourself into believing that you are in control?" Jake's stomach tightened. There was something in her voice that unsettled him. Something sharp. "What do you mean?" She stepped closer, her presence overwhelming, her eyes piercing into him. "You have only scratched the surface of what this power can do. It is far more than a tool for fighting. It can take you to places you never thought possible, or it can destroy you." Jake shook his head. "I faced worse. I can handle it." Seraphis smiled faintly, but there was no warmth in it. "We shall see." Without another word, she turned and gestured for him to follow. Reluctantly, Jake obeyed, his mind swirling with doubt. He couldn't afford to let his guard down. Not now. Not with her. Not with this power. They moved through the palace, deeper into its heart. The corridors were quieter now, and the air seemed heavier, almost oppressive. The walls shimmered with strange symbols that Jake couldn't understand, and the further they went, the more he felt like they were descending into something darker. They arrived at another chamber, this one much different from the others. The walls were dark, covered in ancient carvings that seemed to shift as if alive. The room was empty, save for a single pedestal in the center, where a glowing crystal sat, pulsating with a strange light. "This is your next challenge," Seraphis said, her tone colder now. "You will learn to harness not just the power within you, but the power of the Zoth." Jake looked at the crystal, wary. "What is it?" "A key," she replied simply. "A key to something greater. But you must prove you can control it. Only then will you be ready to face what is coming. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. The Zoth had always been a mysterious, powerful race, and the idea of tapping into their power made him uneasy. He wasn't sure he could trust it, or them. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," he muttered, his eyes locked on the crystal. It was beautiful, but there was something wrong about it. Something dangerous. Seraphis watched him with a calculating gaze. "If you're to stand against what is coming, you must learn. There is no other way." Jake took a deep breath, forcing himself to focus. He had no choice. He had come this far. He couldn't stop now. Slowly, he stepped toward the pedestal, his hand reaching out toward the glowing crystal. The moment his fingers brushed the surface, a jolt of energy shot through him, and he was thrown back, crashing into the wall with a force that knocked the wind out of him. "Do not be so reckless," Seraphis said coldly, her voice echoing in the chamber. "The crystal is a conduit, a channel for the Zoth power. It will not give its strength to someone who does not understand it." Jake pushed himself to his feet, his body aching. The crystal was not just a source of power, it was a test. He had been too hasty, too eager to prove himself. But he knew one thing now. This power wasn't just about strength or will. It was about understanding, patience, control. He approached the pedestal again, this time with more caution. He reached out, his fingers hovering just above the crystal. He felt the energy swirling within it, but this time, instead of diving straight into it, he simply let it come to him, like a tide pulling him under. Slowly, carefully, he began to draw the energy toward himself. The moment he connected with the crystal, the room seemed to come alive. The carvings on the walls glowed brighter, the pulse of the crystal matching the beat of his own heart. He could feel the Zoth power coursing through him. But this time, it was different. It wasn't overwhelming. It wasn't chaotic. It was connected. For the first time, Jake felt like he was truly in control. But even as the power surged through him, he couldn't shake the feeling that Seraphis was watching him, waiting for him to fail. "Very good," she said, her voice cool, but there was a hint of approval. "But remember, this is just a taste. What comes next will be far more difficult." Jake nodded, trying to ignore the seed of doubt that had been planted in his mind. The training was far from over, and he still had much to learn. But one thing was clear. He wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting to control a power that could change everything. And in the end, that power might be the only thing that stood between humanity and the coming storm. Jake Draven stood before Seraphis, his body still humming with the power he had drawn from the Zoth crystal. The energy inside him was controlled now, but it was like a wild beast waiting to break free. He could feel it, like it was just beneath the surface, a force that could tear him apart if he lost focus for even a moment. Seraphis didn't seem to notice his unease. She was watching him with that same cold, calculating expression. She seemed to be evaluating him, as if she were testing him again. "You have learned to control the energy," Seraphis said, her voice low. "But control alone is not enough. You must understand what it is you carry." Jake clenched his fists. "I understand enough," he replied, trying to steady his breath. "I've faced worse than this before. I can handle it." Seraphis didn't respond immediately. Instead, she turned, moving toward one of the dark walls of the chamber. Her hand pressed against the surface, and the wall shimmered, revealing a large, glowing symbol. The symbol pulsed once, then expanded, opening into a doorway. Beyond it, Jake could see something that took his breath away. A vast, open arena, unlike anything he had seen before. It was massive, a battlefield filled with towering stone structures and strange, shifting lights. There was something unnatural about it, as if the space itself was alive. "You are about to face the final test," Seraphis said, her voice unwavering. "This arena will reveal your true nature. Only by surviving will you be ready for what comes next." Jake's heart raced. He had come this far, but the final test. What was it? What kind of challenge awaited him in that eerie arena? "Is this where the Zoth are waiting?" Jake asked, his voice betraying a hint of hesitation. Seraphis turned back to face him, her eyes narrowed. "No, the Zoth are not your enemy yet. This trial is of a different kind. It will show you what you are truly capable of, and whether you can control the power inside you." Jake didn't want to admit it, but a sense of dread crept over him. He had been pushed to his limits already, and now it seemed like the trials were only getting harder. He wasn't sure how much more he could take. Without waiting for him to respond, Seraphis gestured for him to step forward. "Go. The arena will test you. And remember, there is no turning back." Jake hesitated for a moment, the weight of her words sinking in. He had no choice. He had come this far. And the Zoth had given him power. Power he didn't fully understand yet. But he had to master it. He had to learn how to control it. With a deep breath, Jake stepped forward into the doorway. The moment he crossed the threshold, the atmosphere shifted. The air was thick with tension, and the ground beneath him seemed to pulse with strange energy. The arena was alive, its very walls shifting like they had a will of their own. Towering pillars surrounded him, casting long shadows across the arena. There was a sense of something watching him, waiting. Suddenly, the ground trembled beneath his feet, and Jake spun around, his hand instinctively reaching for his energy blade. From the shadows, something emerged. It was huge, taller than any human, with sharp, jagged limbs that scraped against the stone floor. Its body was covered in dark, spiny armor, and its glowing red eyes locked onto Jake with a hunger that sent a chill down his spine. Jake's pulse quickened. The creature was massive, its claws long and sharp. It hissed, its breath heavy and foul as it charged toward him. Without thinking, Jake summoned the energy inside him, drawing on the power that had served him in previous battles. The blade in his hand hummed with energy, and as the creature closed in, Jake swung it with all his strength. The blade connected with the creature's armored side, but it barely made a dent. The beast snarled and lunged again, its claws aimed at Jake's throat. He dodged to the side, narrowly avoiding the deadly strike. The arena was a blur of motion as he scrambled to find his footing. The creature was fast, stronger than he expected, and Jake could feel the energy draining from him as he tried to keep up. He knew he couldn't keep this up forever. He had to think. There had to be a way to defeat it. His mind raced, the power inside him swelling as panic began to set in. The creature struck again, and this time, Jake barely managed to block it with his blade. The force of the blow sent him crashing into one of the stone pillars. He lay there for a moment, winded, his body aching. His blade was still in his hand, but he was losing ground. The creature was relentless. Jake closed his eyes for a moment, trying to regain his composure. He couldn't let fear control him. He had faced worse enemies before. This power, this was his strength, but it had to come from within, not from panic, not from desperation. With a sharp breath, Jake focused. He called on the energy once more, but this time, he did not rush. He let it flow, not forcing it, but letting it come to him. The power filled him like a wave, steady and strong. He opened his eyes, and for the first time, he felt in control. He met the creature's charge head-on, his energy blade glowing with raw power. With a single strike, he cleaved through the creature's defenses, slashing it across its chest. The creature screamed, stumbling back as its body flickered and vanished into thin air. Jake stood there, panting, the energy still swirling around him. The arena was silent now, the walls dimming as if the test had ended. Seraphis's voice echoed from the shadows. "Well done, Captain, but this is only the beginning. You have proven yourself, but now you must learn the true cost of power." Jake's heart pounded in his chest, but one thing was clear: he had survived. The power was his to wield, but as Seraphis said, there would be a cost, and he was about to find out what it was. Jake Draven stood alone in the center of the arena, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The creature had vanished, but the victory felt hollow. He had survived the test, yes, but Seraphis' words weighed heavily on him. You must learn the true cost of power. What did she mean? Was it the physical toll, or something deeper? He looked around, trying to steady himself. The arena, once filled with the hum of strange energy, was now quiet. The glowing walls began to dim, and the air, thick with tension, seemed to dissipate. His muscles still ached, and the power within him, wild, untamed, still swirled just beneath his skin. Seraphis' voice broke the silence, cool and distant as always. You have passed the final trial, Captain, but the journey is far from over. Jake turned to face her. She stood in the shadows, her eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. She was always watching, calculating, as though every move he made was being weighed. He tried to steady his breathing, but the weight of the situation pressed down on him. I passed, but that was just one test. What comes next? Seraphis stepped forward, her gaze piercing. What comes next is not about power, Jake. It's about what you will do with it. Jake frowned, confused. What do you mean? I've done everything you've asked. I controlled the energy. I've fought your creatures. What more is there? Seraphis' expression softened, though not by much. You have learned to control the power within you. But you haven't truly understood it. You haven't faced what it will cost you. And you haven't faced what happens when it's no longer enough. Jake clenched his fists, frustration bubbling inside him. Enough with the riddles. Just tell me what you want me to do. I'm ready for whatever comes next. For a moment, Seraphis said nothing. Her eyes studied him, as though seeing something that Jake couldn't. She stepped closer, her presence overwhelming, yet strangely calming. You are ready for the final lesson. But first, you must understand that power, true power, comes with a price. One that can tear you apart if you are not careful. Jake's stomach twisted. He had been so focused on mastering the energy, on proving that he was strong enough to fight the Zoth Empire, that he hadn't stopped to think about what this power could really mean. Could it consume him? Could it change him into something else? Tell me what I need to do, he said, his voice firmer now, though uncertainty lingered in his chest. Seraphis' eyes gleamed, her lips curling into a faint smile. I want you to use the power you have gained, but not in the way you expect. Before Jake could respond, she raised her hand, and the arena around them began to shift. The air grew colder, and the walls, once dark and shimmering, seemed to dissolve into mist. The ground beneath Jake's feet rumbled, and he felt the familiar surge of energy building inside him once again. Then the mist cleared, and Jake found himself standing in a completely new environment, one he had never seen before. The sky above him was dark, and the landscape stretched endlessly in all directions. Jagged mountains rose in the distance, and the ground was cracked and barren. It felt empty, hollow. Seraphis was gone, and Jake was alone, standing in the middle of this desolate world. For a moment, he simply stood there, trying to understand what was happening. Then, a sharp voice echoed in his mind. This is the cost of your power, Captain. Jake's eyes widened. The voice wasn't Seraphis. It was something older, more powerful, like it was coming from the very air itself. He could feel the weight of it pressing down on him, suffocating him with its presence. He closed his eyes, trying to block it out, but it was inside him. This power, this energy. The ground beneath him trembled again, and Jake turned just in time to see a massive rift open up in the earth. From the rift, something crawled out, a creature unlike anything he had seen before. It was enormous, its body covered in sharp, glistening scales. Its eyes glowed with the same energy that surged within him. It was a reflection of the power he had unlocked, but darker, more dangerous. This creature was not something he could defeat with sheer strength. It was born from the very energy that coursed through him. Jake's heart raced as the creature roared, its voice shaking the ground beneath him. He didn't hesitate this time. He called on the power, summoning it to his side, but he could feel the energy pulling at him, trying to take control. The same wild force that had surged through him during the trials was back, stronger than ever. He had to focus. He couldn't let the energy consume him. He couldn't let it turn him into the monster standing before him. With a fierce cry, Jake channeled the power into his blade, focusing every ounce of his will into the strike. The blade surged with energy, and he swung it at the creature, but it wasn't enough. The creature shrugged off the attack, its scales glowing with the same power Jake had tried to control. Jake stumbled back, the energy within him becoming more difficult to control. It was pushing him, urging him to unleash more, to use everything he had. But he couldn't. He couldn't let it go that far. "You are the key to everything," the voice echoed again, and Jake felt the weight of its truth settle deep within him. The power he had unlocked could destroy not just the Zoth, but everything. It could destroy him. With a final, desperate effort, Jake raised his blade one last time, and this time, instead of attacking, he focused all his energy into containing the creature. The energy flowed around him, weaving a shield of light, and with a burst of force, he forced the creature back into the rift. As the rift closed, the world around him began to fade. The power, though still inside him, had settled into a strange kind of calm. Seraphis' voice returned, soft and approving. "You have learned the cost, Captain. You now know that power, when uncontrolled, can destroy everything. But you also know that, in the end, it is you who decides what it will become." Jake looked down at his hands, the energy still pulsing beneath his skin. He had faced the power. He had learned its true cost. But now, more than ever, he knew that the fight wasn't just against the Zoth. It was against the power within him, and he would have to fight it every day. Jake Draven had barely settled into the strange and foreign palace before things began to shift. The towering halls of the Zoth capital, with their glowing crystals and alien architecture, felt like they were pressing in on him. But nothing had prepared him for what happened next. Queen Seraphis stood before him, her gaze unreadable. With a slow, deliberate movement, she gestured for him to follow. As they walked deeper into the palace, the air seemed to grow heavier, charged with an energy that hummed beneath the surface. Jake could feel it, the power radiating from every corner of the palace, yet no one spoke. The Zoth guards who flanked them were silent, their eyes sharp and calculating, as if they were watching for the smallest sign of weakness. They passed through long corridors, each more grand and imposing than the last. The walls shimmered with unknown technology, and the floor seemed to pulse with a strange rhythm, almost as though it were alive. The palace was not just a building. It was a living entity, connected to the very heart of the Zoth Empire. Jake had seen many alien structures in his career, but this was different. This was ancient, steeped in power and mystery. He couldn't shake the feeling that every step he took was leading him into the unknown. Finally, they'd reached a large chamber, its size enough to make even Jake feel small. The room was filled with strange equipment, devices that hummed and glowed with an eerie light. In the center stood a giant, transparent sphere, floating in midair, suspended by an unseen force. It glimmered with shifting colors, as if it were alive. "This is where the training will begin," Seraphis said, her voice calm but firm. "You will learn to harness the power hidden within you, the potential that humanity does not yet understand." Jake looked at her, confused. "What do you mean, hidden power? I'm just a soldier. I don't have anything special." Seraphis' eyes flickered, a hint of something, almost like amusement, flashing in them. "You are much more than that, Captain. Your species has a resilience that no other in the galaxy possesses. But it is not just physical strength. Your minds, your hearts, you carry within you something far more powerful. I intend to unlock that power." Jake swallowed. He didn't know what she was talking about. All he knew was how to fight, how to survive. But if she was offering something more, something that could change humanity's place in the galaxy, He couldn't turn it down. Seraphis raised her hand, and the room seemed to shift. The transparent sphere glowed brighter, casting a strange light across the walls. Jake felt a strange pressure in his mind, as though something was reaching for him, probing the deepest corners of his thoughts. The sensation was overwhelming, and Jake fought to keep his focus. He had dealt with many difficult situations in his life, but this was unlike anything he had experienced. It was as if his very soul was being tested. "Focus," Seraphis commanded, her voice cutting through the fog in his mind. "Do not fight it. Let it in." Jake closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. He had trained for every type of combat, from hand-to-hand to space battles, but nothing had prepared him for this. He felt a strange warmth spread through him, like a fire igniting deep inside. The pressure on his mind grew stronger, and for a moment he thought he might break. But then something clicked. He opened his eyes, and the room around him seemed to blur. The strange energy pulsing through the chamber suddenly felt familiar, like it was a part of him. He could see it now, the threads of power that connected everything. The energy flowing through the walls, through the air, through his own body. "You see it now," Seraphis said, her voice full of approval. "This is just the beginning. You have untapped potential, Jake Draven. Your species has it in abundance, but you have not learned to use it. I will teach you." Jake nodded slowly, still trying to process everything. He could feel the energy thrumming inside him, alive and vibrant. It wasn't just power, it was understanding, a deep connection to the world around him. The possibilities were endless, and the weight of it all pressed down on him. But as much as the power intrigued him, there was something else that bothered him. The Zoth Queen had made it clear that she wanted something from him, something more than just his military skills. What was her true purpose in all this? What did she want with humanity's hidden potential? Before he could ask, Seraphis turned toward him. "You will face many challenges in this place, Captain. The training will not be easy. But know this, I do not give my trust lightly. You will earn it." Jake didn't respond immediately. Instead, he focused on the energy inside him, trying to harness it, to understand it. He knew one thing for certain. He was in a game far bigger than he had ever imagined, and his role was just beginning. Seraphis watched him closely, her expression unreadable. "Come. The next trial awaits." As Jake followed her, he realized that this training wasn't just about learning new skills. It was about transforming everything he thought he knew about himself and the universe. Whatever happened next, he had to be ready. And somehow, deep down, he knew that the future of humanity depended on it.